Everyone thinks big industry begins with smokestacks. Wrong. It begins with a warehouse in 1756 on the Rhine, where the Haniels learned what was moving, who needed it, and what would be scarce next. That single advantage pulled them from trade into coal and iron, and into building the Ruhr's industrial machine. This starts with a warehouse on the Rhine, and ends with a family that learned how to survive every economic extinction event. Because this is not just the story of one company. It is the blueprint for how the Ruhr region turned into Europe's factory floor, and how one family learned to stay powerful even when the original factory economy started fading. Here is the twist to holding your head, because it explains almost every move they make for the next 250 years. Their first unfair advantage was not steel. It was location and logistics. Sitting on the Rhine, watching the flow of Europe like it was a live dashboard. The Haniels did not just ride German industry, they helped build the tracks it ran on. So let's go back to the most boring sounding origin story imaginable, and why it is secretly a money machine. In 1756, in Ruhr, near Duisburg, a customs inspector named Jan Willem Nuit opens a warehouse. That is it. No mines, no furnaces, no machines, just the place where goods are stored, checked, and forwarded. If that sounds small, it is only because we forget what the Rhine was. The Rhine was Europe's highway. Before railways and highways, water is the cheapest, fastest way to move heavy stuff. Timber, grain, wine, metal, and later, coal. If you run warehousing and forwarding on a river like that, you do something more valuable than moving boxes. You learn information. You see what is arriving late, what is arriving early, what is selling out, what nobody wants, what costs more this month than last month. Before factories, the real king was whoever moved stuff faster and cheaper. A warehouse sounds small until you realize it is a radar screen for the whole region's economy. And that radar screen creates a kind of power that does not look like power yet. Because if you can predict demand, you can start choosing what to trade, not just how to store it. And that is the bridge into the next move, the move that turns a warehouse into a dynasty. Seeing demand leads you to better goods. Then it leads you to the essentials, what everyone needs before they can make anything else. Which brings us to the turning point. Jakob Wilhelm Haniel marries into the family, and together with Nuit's daughter Aletta, they expand beyond simple forwarding. Company histories often talk about wine trading in this period, which makes sense. Wine is valuable, it travels well, it has repeat customers. But the important part is not wine. It is the skill they're building. Follow the flow, then climb the ladder. Then 1782 happens. Jakob W. Haniel dies, and in most family business stories, this is where the music stops. The founder dies, the heirs fight, the creditors circle, the operation shrinks. 1782 should have been the end. Instead, it became the upgrade. Aletta Haniel keeps the enterprise alive and keeps it growing with her children. This is the first survival rule of dynasties. Continuity beats brilliance. You do not need every generation to be a genius. You need the machine to keep running when life happens. Aletta does more than keep it running. She points it at the future, coal and iron. Because once you are operating on the Rhine, you are not just watching wine and cloth. You are watching the early pulse of industrial energy. Coal starts to matter more, the fuel that makes everything else cheaper and bigger. So the family moves deeper into coal transport, and then into coal mining, and into iron smelting. That sequence is not random. Transport gives you access, mining gives you supply, smelting gives you transformation. And once you touch coal and iron, you are one step away from owning the entire industrial stack. They go from moving coal to owning coal to turning coal into iron. That's how you stop being a trader and become industry. Which leads straight to the person who turns the Haniel story from a strong trading family into an industrial force, Franz Haniel. Born in 1779, active through the early 1800s, and leading the business into a new era. Franz's move is a concept that sounds modern, but it is basically industrial common sense. Vertical integration. Here's what that means in plain English. Own the bottlenecks. If you only trade iron, you are exposed to every supplier problem and every price swing. If you only transport coal, you are exposed to every mine owner who can squeeze you. But if you control the chain, transport, inputs, and production, you gain bargaining power and resilience. If you buy coal, you are a customer. If you own the mine, you are the price. Franz's play was simple. Stop renting the engine, build the whole engine room. Under Franz, the story becomes trade to mines, to smelting, to machines. And when you do that, you do not just profit from industry. You become part of what makes industry possible in the first place. This is why the Ruhr explodes as an industrial region. Once coal, transport, and factories link up, the Ruhr snowballs into Europe's industrial engine. And that brings us to steam. Steam was not a gadget. It was a cheat code for moving more coal, more iron, more everything. In Haniel histories, Franz is associated with early industrial innovations in transport and engineering in the Ruhr. They were early in rail and steam shipping on the Rhine. What we can say safely is this: they were early adopters and builders in the steam age, and they invested in the industrial logistics that made the Ruhr run. They did another thing that sounds surprising from a heavy industry pioneer. They invested in workers, not just machines. Company accounts often credit Franz with employee housing and social projects. Housing kept workers close and loyal. But either way, it signals something important. They were not thinking like short-term traders anymore. They weren't just chasing deals. They were building a permanent machine. Franz dies in 1868. So here comes the next problem that kills most dynasties: succession at scale. A business that depends on one dominant operator is fragile the moment that operator is gone. After Franz's death, his heirs formalize the group and keep expanding into areas that match what they are already good at: shipping, freight, chemicals, infrastructure beyond Germany. The Ruhr is becoming a powerhouse, and Haniel is riding that wave. But now we hit the move that is quietly one of the smartest and rarest decisions long-lived wealthy families make. They separate ownership from management. In the early 1900s, the family increasingly leaves day-to-day operations to professional managers, while the family stays in a strategic owner role. Most dynasties die in the handoff. The Haniels tried something radical: step back. They kept the steering wheel, but hired professional drivers. This is the second survival rule. Families do not last by finding endless geniuses. They last by building governance that survives average heirs. They wrote rules so the company wouldn't depend on who was born smart. And the reason this matters is that the next test is not a normal recession. It is the most violent economic and political storm Europe will ever see. From 1933 to 1945. If your factories sit in the industrial heart of Germany, war does not affect you. War reorganizes you. The Ruhr is strategically crucial. It is energy, metal, machinery, transport. It becomes a core target and a core asset. Haniel-linked businesses suffer major losses during the Second World War, like much of the region. Destruction, disruption, and then the aftermath. So the honest takeaway is this: the war is a rupture, materially and morally, and it breaks the old world that Ruhr industry was built on. After 1945, the break becomes permanent, because the post-war settlement forces restructuring. For Haniel, that includes being forced to relinquish much of its coal and iron businesses. So the family faces a decision that is easy to say and hard to live. Do you rebuild the thing that made you rich, or do you pivot? This is where the Haniel story becomes very different from the stereotype of an industrial dynasty clinging to the original glory. They rebuild, but not by trying to rewind history. They diversify. They move into oil trading, construction materials, pharmaceutical-related wholesaling, and retail. But the strategic pattern is clear. They stop being the coal family and become investors. Then comes the boldest move of all. Haniel exits coal, iron, and steel entirely. Let that sink in. They walk away from the very industries that made the Ruhr and made the family one of its builders. Most industrial families cling to the original gold mine. Haniel walked away from theirs. They did not abandon tradition. They abandoned decline. This is the third survival rule: knowing when to leave the business that made you rich. And the bonus rule is the hardest one: master the exit. They sold before the decline crushed them. This pivot turns Haniel into something closer to modern family equity. They become a holding company, buy good businesses, improve them, sell, repeat. So what does the modern Haniel machine look like when it is no longer about coal mines and blast furnaces? It looks like decision-making. By the 2010s, Haniel is often described as holding stakes in practical industrial business services, boring essentials that keep other companies running. Examples commonly cited around that era include CWS Boco in cleaning, hygiene, and workwear services, ELG in stainless steel raw materials and recycling, and Tact in business supplies. Their portfolio shifts, but the theme stays the same: boring essentials for businesses, not consumer glamour, industrial plumbing, the stuff companies need to keep operating. Here's a snapshot that shows how large this quiet machine became. By 2013, about 650 shareholders, about 56,000 employees, about 30 countries, and about 26 billion euros in revenue. That is not a family business in the casual sense. That is a system. Their real product is staying aligned for 250 years, which leads to the question that makes the whole story click. How does a family stay coordinated with hundreds of shareholders? How do you avoid the classic disaster where the third and fourth generation fight, dilute, and sell at the bottom? This is where governance becomes the real invention. The family's role becomes values, oversight, big strategic choices, and patience. Management's role becomes execution. And if that sounds obvious, it is not. Most families cannot resist the urge to micromanage, or the urge to cash out, or the urge to keep a legacy business long after it stops making sense. Rules plus professionals running the company means no family drama killing the business. So here's the clean takeaway: the Haniel playbook, and why this family helped build Germany's big industry and outlived it. Control flows. They started by controlling the movement of goods on the Rhine. They own the river's choke point and the information. Control bottlenecks. Under Franz Haniel, they moved toward vertical integration, owning more of the chain so they are not hostage to suppliers and buyers. They kept buying the next step in the chain until they controlled the whole thing. Control succession. They separate ownership from management early enough that it becomes culture, not a temporary experiment. Family owns, professionals run. Everyone follows the rules. And the bonus part, the part that makes them unusual in the Ruhr story? Master the exit. They build big industry in Germany and then prove the bigger skill is surviving after big industry fades. That is the punchline hiding inside the warehouse in 1756. A warehouse became a dynasty because they kept upgrading the same question: where is the power moving next? First it was the river, then it was coal and iron, then it was steam and scale, then it was governance, then it was diversification. And today, it is the ability to keep making those shifts without breaking the family or the business. That is how a warehouse on the Rhine turns into a modern holding company. Not by predicting the future once. They didn't predict the future. They adapted faster than everyone else for 250 years.